In this lecture, we will define muscle and identify the three types of muscle tissue, differentiate skeletal muscle from the others, and examine the gross anatomy of skeletal muscle specifically. So let's get started. What is muscle? Well, muscle is a soft tissue, in contrast to bone, that is found throughout the body. Now, muscle is composed of protein in the form of filaments, and those protein filaments specifically are called actin and myosin. More on that later. Now, muscle is one of four primary tissue types making up the human body. The four primary tissue types are epithelial tissue. Now, epithelial tissue covers body surfaces. Your skin is a great example of epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue lines internal passageways, like your esophagus, which we discussed in Lecture 6. Now, your glands are also composed of epithelial tissue. Glands, like your salivary glands, also discussed in Lecture 6. The second primary tissue type is connective tissue. Connective tissue provides structural support to other tissues in the body. So tendons, which connect muscles to bones, and ligaments, which connect bones together, are examples of dense connective tissue. Bone is also a great example of supportive connective tissue. The job of fluid connective tissue is to transport essential materials throughout the body. So blood is a great example of fluid connective tissue. It transports nutrients, oxygen, and waste material through the body. And finally, connective tissue, like adipose or fat tissue, is responsible for storing energy. Now, nervous tissue, also called neural tissue, carries information to and from various parts of the body in the form of electrical impulses. 98% of your nervous tissue is concentrated in your central nervous system, or CNS. The CNS consists, of course, of your brain and spinal cord. And finally, we have muscle tissue, the fourth primary tissue type, and it is, of course, the topic of this lecture. Here's a fun fact. Your muscular system makes up about 44% of the weight of your body, so it's quite a substantial system. Now, finally, muscle cells are specialized for contraction, which we will discuss shortly. Now, there are three types of muscle tissue found throughout the body: smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, perhaps you can guess as to where you might find cardiac muscle, and skeletal muscle. So we'll briefly differentiate the three. Now, one notable feature of smooth muscle is that it works automatically. In other words, you don't have to think about making smooth muscle work. It just works. For that reason, we call smooth muscle involuntary. Now, smooth muscle can be found in the walls of blood vessels, like your arteries and your veins, as well as in the digestive and respiratory tracts. Smooth muscle functions to regulate the diameter of blood vessels and respiratory passages, as well as move food, remember the bolus, in the esophagus. Smooth muscle contractions in the digestive tract is called peristalsis. Cardiac muscle, like smooth muscle, is obviously involuntary. That is, you don't have to think about making your heart beat. It just beats. As its name implies, cardiac muscle is found only in your heart. Now, both smooth muscle and skeletal muscle are found throughout the body. Cardiac muscle functions to circulate blood through the body, as well as maintain blood pressure. And finally, we have skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is the only one of the three muscle types that is voluntary. That is, you control your skeletal muscles. So here's the caveat with regard to skeletal muscle. Often you may not be aware that you are controlling skeletal muscle, but it is voluntary. For example, when you walk, you put one foot in front of the other. You're not consciously thinking about that, you just walk. But walking is completely under your control. You either choose to walk or you choose not to walk. Now, by contrast, the heart, remember that cardiac muscle is involuntary, beats on its own. You do not choose whether or not your heart beats. It just beats. Now, just as smooth muscle is found throughout the body, so too skeletal muscle is ubiquitous. And as the name implies, skeletal muscle is connected by way of tendons, remember, to the bones of the skeleton. Now, through these connections, skeletal muscle functions to move, position, and stabilize the skeleton. Now, finally, skeletal muscle generates heat. Now, when skeletal muscle contracts, its very long parallel fibers rub against one another, creating friction. Now, as happens when you vigorously rub your hands together, heat is generated. This heat can be beneficial, as if you're cross-country skiing on a cold winter morning, or it can be detrimental, as if you're walking through the desert in the middle of summer. Make sure you drink plenty of water. Either way, when skeletal muscle contracts, heat is released. Now, skeletal muscle tissue contains very large muscle cells. In fact, some muscle cells can be up to 1 foot or more in length. Of course, none of the muscles in your face are that long, but think of something like your quadricep or thigh muscles. Because skeletal muscle cells are long and slender, we refer to these cells as muscle fibers. And we normally think of cells as having a single nucleus. However, because skeletal muscle fibers are comparatively long, each contains many nuclei, as many as several hundred in fact in some cases. Unlike most other cell types, skeletal muscle fibers cannot divide. However, adult muscles contain embedded microsatellite cells or stem cells which are capable of making new muscle tissue. As a result, adult muscle tissue is able to repair itself, to a degree anyway, after injury. So for example, running a marathon causes microscopic tears in your leg muscles. Your microsatellite cells can repair those tiny tears. Now, I know this course is a gross anatomy course. However, because skeletal muscle fibers are comparatively large, I want to make note of one microscopic feature: striations. A short while ago, I mentioned to you that muscle tissue is made up of 2 proteins, actin and myosin. Now, these 2 proteins exist in the form of filaments that join together to eventually form individual muscle fibers. Actin filaments are thin, that is less than 6 nanometers in diameter, while myosin filaments are thicker, up to 15 nanometers in diameter. Now, a nanometer is 1/1000th of a meter. A meter is about 3.5 feet, so you can see how thin these filaments really are. So actin and myosin filaments overlap in skeletal muscle fibers, giving the appearance of alternating thin and thick filaments. Now, it is this apparent alternation of thick and thin, or actin and myosin filaments, that gives skeletal muscle its very distinctive microscopic banding appearance. So these light and dark bands then are known as striations. Striations are not unique to skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle has striations as well. Smooth muscle does not. Striations are very distinctive in the microscopic presentation of skeletal muscle. So in the next lecture, we will locate and identify the major skeletal muscles of mastication and the tongue. So I'll see you shortly.